My name is Rose Gottemoeller. I'm the Payne Distinguished Lecturer at the Freeman Spogli Institute. That's associated with the Center for International Security and Arms Control at Stanford University. Also a research fellow at the Hoover Institution. And it's my great pleasure and pride to host these European Security Initiative lectures. This morning, we have the wonderful opportunity to speak with a dear friend and colleague of mine, Daniel Baer. Dan Baer was the ambassador to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe during the Obama administration, leaving that post in January of 2017. Dan and I worked very closely together throughout that period, both on my many visits to the OSCE for reasons of briefing on conventional arms control, but also sometimes on nuclear matters as well. And he and I spent a long time sitting in his garden and talking about the future of the OSCE and where the OSCE should go as the next decade unfurls. And so I thought it would be a great opportunity this morning to turn to him again and hear what he thinks, particularly at a time of great challenge for the organization. We've just seen the Russians building up their forces on the southwest borders of the Russian Federation up against Ukraine. The Russian seizure of Crimea, of course, continues to be a serious security problem for Europe, as well as Russian destabilization of the eastern part of Ukraine, the Donbass. So we remain very, very concerned about that, but the OSCE has had a special role in that conflict and has been trying, of course, to advance a resolution of that very difficult situation. So there's a lot to talk about this morning. One other thing I wanted to mention about Dan is that he was always such a gracious host. He and his partner Brian would allow me to stay with them, but also allow me to host quiet, very under the radar screen talks with my Russian counterparts and other counterparts in his back garden. And it was a very, very useful venue. And I always appreciated how Dan was so flexible and ready to participate in different parts of US diplomacy at that time that were not directly related to the OSCE. But Dan, I wanted to say thank you once again for the use of your garden and for all the gracious hospitality during those years in Vienna. So without further ado, I'm going to jump into my first question. I have about 5 questions for you, and then after that, we'll throw it open to the audience. So for the audience, you can use the Q&A function here. That's the best way to get a question to me, but you are also free to use the chat function, and I'll keep an eye on the questions coming in. But let's get started talking about the future of the OSCE, because, you know, the OSCE grew out of the CSCE. This was the series of negotiations that were conducted over many years and led to the Helsinki Final Act. This was really a product of the Cold War. After the end of the Cold War, there was a decade where the OSCE played an important role. But indeed, a cynic might say that that was not because the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe was a great platform for cooperation, but rather that the Cold War left only one superpower standing, a dominant force at that time in Europe. So in this post-Cold War era, the OSCE has often, I think, and we've discussed this frequently, struggled to be effective. And this is something we talked about in discussing a potential reform agenda for the OSCE. Dan, why don't you pick up on that thread and let us know what you're thinking about today?
Sure. First of all, thank you very much for having me. It's a delight to be with you. And one of the things that people perhaps don't think about enough when they think about government service is certainly for me and for everybody I was lucky enough to serve with. I think all of us would say that the thing that we remember most fondly and we're most grateful for was our colleagues. It is a team sport, and I felt incredibly lucky to be on Rose's team and to work together with you and so many others. Thank you for having me back, and it's wonderful to see you. You know, I think one of the things, obviously, I probably spent more time thinking about the OSCE than most people have by virtue of the role. And but I think it's actually a broader, there are broader lessons here. You know, multilateral institutions, organizations that are built with the table and a set of players around the table, they are always products of a moment, and there's always this question of whether they can evolve to meet other moments. And they are always driven, they're always only as good as the folks around the table decide to make them. And they can survive periods of kind of free ridership by certain participants, but they really suffer when there is sabotage or saboteurs, when one state or multiple states, particularly powerful ones, decide that they no longer see a use in an organization, that can be a death knell. And I think, on the one hand, when I look at the OSCE, I think, okay, it grew out of the Cold War. I mean, the Cold War has to be a more difficult time than now in terms of tensions. And here I mean tensions between what was then the Soviet Union and the West, and now what we often and perhaps unconstructively talk about as Russia and the West. I mean, there were the tensions of the Cold War had to be more difficult, and yet those tensions also provided a structure. As you said, there were two superpowers, and that created an impetus for negotiation, a reason for negotiation. And there was also an existential threat that still exists, but was much more palpable and top of mind then, which was the possibility of nuclear annihilation. And that was, I think we forget how much that was a driving force on both sides for finding some way to reach out. And indeed, the OSCE, the Soviets wanted to actually have a conversation about kind of solidifying the post-World War II and really the kind of the 5 to 10 years post-World War II borders in Europe, in order to solidify their control over Eastern Europe and the Baltics. They wanted to have that conversation in the 50s, and it took until détente for that conversation to start happening. And indeed, when the Helsinki Final Act was signed, Henry Kissinger was not a huge fan of the Helsinki Final Act. There were a lot of people in America who thought it was a huge concession to the Soviets because acknowledgement that borders should not be changed by force. And indeed, the Soviets thought it was a huge victory and printed the text of the Helsinki Final Act in Pravda. And of course, we know that the security principles that were outlined in the Helsinki Final Act did end up becoming a really important set of reference points for political negotiations that would follow in the following quarter century. The human rights basket, which the Soviets didn't pay much attention to because they had no intention of upholding anyway when they signed it, also ended up becoming crucially important to the movements in Eastern Europe in the 1980s and early 90s that were supporting the democratic transition. So it was even in its own, I guess it's a long way of saying, even in its own time, it wasn't totally understood for what it was or what the significance it might have. So as we think about what significance it can have in our time, I think it's really important to take I guess I would say candidly that my view is that the Russians have treated it as a place to be obstructionist, generally speaking, over the last decade, and have not identified areas where they want to move forward. And it is, for those of you who aren't familiar with the OSCE, it operates based on consensus. So one player can, of the 57, around the table can obstruct progress. And I think one of the things that we have to think about for those of us who continue to see it as a useful platform and as a platform that we need as an insurance policy, I mean, I think we should always think about the fact that you pay premiums every year on your insurance policy, and most years it seems like a lot to pay, but in the year that it's a good deal. And I think multilateral institutions are akin to insurance policies. We pay premiums constantly, and when we really need them, we're really grateful to have them. And obviously 2014 was a case where that was true. So one of the things I think we need to spend time thinking about is what are the real values that the OSCE can deliver for the Russian Federation in the next decade, and not not the fake things that they throw out, or the cynical people, but what genuinely the OSCE deliver that would be of value given Russian security concerns, Russian economic concerns going forward. And I think there are things that can be delivered. And I think having that conversation with the Russians is probably an important way to move the OSCE and new utility for it in the coming decades.
Could you say just perhaps a little bit more about that? What would you advise the Biden administration about making use of the OSCE now? And they have, as you know, signaled that they are, of course, going to be tough on Russia where it is necessary to be tough. We just saw the sanctions applied in the last 10 days on the solar wind hack, as well as on meddling in US elections, but they're also looking for ways to cooperate with the Russians. We had Vladimir Putin talking at the multilateral climate change conference, and by the way, with a fairly even-tempered speech at the climate change meeting that President Biden hosted last week. And then there's also, of course, the strategic stability agenda, which does get attention, and Biden and Putin have both pointed to. But I've welcomed also that the Biden administration seems to be putting Ukraine more on the bilateral agenda with Russia than it has been in the last administration, where the emphasis was all on the Minsk process and on the role that Macron and Merkel could play in helping to solve the issues between Ukraine and Russia. But so what would you advise given all that, and that's a lot, but what would you advise the Biden administration about how they should be thinking about using the OSCE in their efforts?
Well, I mean, I think multilateral organizations have much more utility to an American administration that sees the role of the United States as what I like to call the cooperator in chief. And when you treat foreign policy as a series of bilateral transactions, as I believe the previous administration did, it's not surprising that you see less utility in multilateral fora. I think part of what you've just laid out is that the OSCE as such, like the UN or any other organization, is not a panacea, and its utility from a constructive contribution standpoint has to be part of a broader scope. The OSCE should be one part of our strategy, of the US strategy for engaging Russia. There will obviously be a robust bilateral track. There should also be a very robust track on coordinating with our NATO allies. I think one reason why maybe the Biden administration is putting some of this stuff into what appears to be a bilateral channel is just we're establishing the bilateral channel again, a healthy one, a normal one, an adult one with serious tone, and so the key issues need to be on the agenda. That doesn't mean that we do the work purely through a bilateral channel going forward, and I expect that we will continue to engage the French and the Germans and the Brits and others in Europe in how to address European security challenges, including those posed by Russia. And I think, going back to kind of the previous question, there was a time when the Russians were super enthusiastic about the OSCE because they thought it could to be the alternative to NATO. That there was a possibility that the OSCE would rise and supplant the role that was played by NATO during the Cold War, and that the OSCE would be this forum where they were on equal footing and therefore, much more comfortable to them. And I think there has been some disappointment from their side that didn't happen. But I guess, and I don't expect it will happen in the future, but I think there's a risk throwing the baby with the bathwater from Russia. It is still a place where the Russians are on equal footing with key Western partners around the table, and if they chose to use it well, they could actually use it as a place to put tough negotiations on the table and advance their objectives. And I don't dismiss I'm not Pollyannish about how easy that would be, but I think it is still one of the things that I think we should keep in mind and that we should tell the Russians is that we have both the United States and NATO allies, and the Russians fail to probably make as much OSCE for our own purposes as we might have. And it does take two to tango, and I think there are possibilities going forward. But I think the Biden administration, I think one early test of kind of how seriously the Biden administration takes the OSCE will be to see who they appoint as ambassador. And if they appoint somebody who is known as a serious policy person who has prior relationships with the National Security Advisor, Secretary of State, maybe the president, then indication that they intend to use the platform as a serious component of their strategy, Europe and on Russia and Central Asia.
Let me ask a quick follow-up, Dan. It wasn't precisely on the list before me, but you and I used to talk quite frequently about how we get beyond some of the stovepiping that naturally occurs. It occurs in any bureaucracy, but it occurs in international diplomacy as well. And particularly after I left to be Deputy Secretary General of NATO, I was very keen to try to figure out ways to help NATO and the OSCE work together smoothly and regularly, routinely, instead of what tends to happen, which is the two of them get stovepiped and then they sometimes get a little jealous of each other and they frankly don't communicate very well. So I'm interested in what your advice is today, several years on and reflecting and observing. What would you advise NATO and the OSCE going forward about how they should be talking to each other?
I'm not sure there's anything particularly creative or novel, but there has to be a decision among institutional leadership. So the Secretary Generals should make the decision that they want to have that kind of cooperative relationship, and information sharing, I think, is one of the most important pieces of that. And obviously there has to be a decision among key players in both institutions. I used to make a point of going to visit NATO periodically in order to make sure that NATO ambassadors understood the things that we were trying to work on at the OSCE that were relevant to them, whether that was, we developed the first ever set of confidence building measures on cyber at the OSCE, and in the first set in late 2013 and the second, I think, in 2015. And I wanted our NATO colleagues to know about that because I knew they were working on stuff too. And I wanted them to know about the things that were agreed to there in the confidence building measures, so that if there was reason to use those things like the hotline or the request for consultations, that they would know that those were available to them. And so, I think encouraging the cross-pollination in the form of human beings, from between Vienna and Brussels is really important. I do think that one of the things that's happened in the last few years is that, the enduring presence of over 1,000 people on the ground in Ukraine in the form of the OSCE Observer Mission has, I think, deepened appreciation by NATO colleagues as well as colleagues in capitals across Europe and North America for the fact base that the OSCE can help provide, that gives folks in capitals a better sense of how to make good policy, not only vis-a-vis the OSCE or NATO, but more broadly. I think one of the things that policymakers need is facts. There are usually a surplus of opinions and a deficit of facts when you're making policy, and the OSCE can contribute to making up that deficit.
Yeah, that is very, very true. And by the way, it's a good thing, I think, that the top leaders of the two organizations, although they weren't working together all the time, but Helga Schmidt now at the OSCE, as well as Jens Stoltenberg at NATO, have a good, a good working relationship. They know each other from the Brussels milieu and Helga's work at the EU. So I do hope that those kinds of links from the top down can form up on a regular basis now. But let's turn to the role of the OSCE in Ukraine. I have a couple questions already on that in the Q&A, but one kind of dark side of all of this is they have been there. The monitoring mission has been there now for so many years, 1,000 people on the ground. And don't you think there's an element of this that they have contributed to the formation of a frozen conflict? Is this a dark side of what you're talking about, and how can the OSCE avoid that in the future?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously there is a concern. I should say, there was a concern from the outset. When we were negotiating the mandate for the mission in the spring of 2014, and obviously things were moving very quickly at that point. There was a lot of disinformation being spread around. And in fact, the original rationale for the observer mission was Russian disinformation about human rights violations in Eastern Ukraine. And the response was, if there's such concern about that, we should have observers on the ground to report on those things. And that was the original kind of conversation. The observer mission ended up being much more about observing the conflict between Russian and Russian-backed forces and Ukrainian forces in Eastern Ukraine. And obviously that conflict continues. There are people being killed most days, and the front lines are still heavily fortified, et cetera. And so, say, unlike Moldova, where kinetic activity is limited, that it's not truly frozen. But there was a concern from the outset that we have to be careful not to reinforce divisions, but rather make sure that we are an accessory to political process, and to creating an alternative to a military solution. And I think what this underscores, again, is that, and this is a responsibility for the United States, perhaps chief among the rest, the hard work of international politics can't be outsourced to multilateral organizations. The heavy hitters in international politics have to continue to play a leading role. And that leading role can be coordinated. For instance, Angela Merkel's leadership, in particular, in trying to negotiate de-escalations and solutions to this in 2015, 2016. It doesn't mean that it has to be the U.S. president who's conducting shuttle diplomacy, but the United States has to stay engaged, because the politics don't solve themselves just because you put an observer mission on the ground. The observer mission can be a crucial and indispensable tool, but it doesn't create the solution that is needed. And so, we should see the observer mission as part of a broader set of actions, which could include, bilateral sanctions and steps that have nothing to do with the OSCE on the surface, but are part of a broader approach to resolving what is a political conflict that is continuing to manifest itself in military conflict. And so I think, without pretending like there was ever an easy solution on the table, shame on us if we let it go another 7 years and are still there, because we collectively, the international community, need to make a play to help try to support peaceful resolution of the conflict. I mean, it is a continuing security challenge for Europe. It is obviously having hugely deleterious effects on millions of Ukrainians whose futures whose last 7 years have been damaged and whose futures are imperiled by this. We need to make a push to try to resolve the conflict, and I don't underestimate the difficulty of that. But that's what grown-up governments do. They take on the hardest problems.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more that, of course, a big, well, any international actor, I was going to say big international actors, but international actors can't outsource where they need to be taking responsibility to an international organization. I can't agree with you more. But I also like the flip side of your point, which is that you need to have some organic links between what you're doing, as a matter of bilateral diplomacy or in some cases multilateral diplomacy, and how you are working with and making use of what an international organization such as the OSCE has to offer. I've actually mourned the fact that sometimes the OSCE in recent years has been seen, well, everything's just kind of ground to a halt there, and let's just kind of put it over here and forget about it. But I was pleased for that reason that the monitoring mission in Ukraine took such a role. And also, I wanted to pay a brief compliment because you brought up the cyber confidence building measures earlier. And that was an area of, I thought, really interesting progress because there the Russians were willing to contribute in a positive way and help to advance that particular agenda. So I for one, hope that the Biden administration will consider the OSCE as part of, again, the panoply of tools, both its own tools, but also international tools that it has available in advancing its own policy goals in an organic way. Let's put it that way. But let me turn, it's also a very difficult question, Dan, but another difficult arena this past year where there has been conflict is Nagorno-Karabakh and the conflict between Azerbaijan and Armenia. And, obviously Russia supplying weapons to both sides, strange diplomatic setting overall. The OSCE didn't really play a role there, at least as far as I know. And I would be interested what you think about its role in the future. Should there be more action by the OSCE in the South Caucasus, and particularly in regard to trying to resolve this particular situation, Nagorno-Karabakh?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. The OSCE has been engaged on that conflict for decades, and I think looking forward, there's opportunities both on the political level and the humanitarian one for the OSCE to play an important role, and frankly, European countries to use the OSCE there as a platform for delivering, particularly support on the ground. What has happened in the last 12 months. Is almost a reversal of the status quo ex ante. It used to be that Armenia was, generally speaking, the status quo supporting power in that conflict, and that Azerbaijan was the revisionist one. And Azerbaijan's victory in the war that began last September has left those roles inverted. And well, in some sense, that took the energy out of the spring that had been loaded, and that many of us had been concerned about for many years. We would be wrong to think that this arrival of a new status quo is a peace. There was a late night agreement signed, brokered by Putin again in November, which was a ceasefire, but it is not a peace agreement. And the challenge of making peace remains and will be very difficult. So I think a few things. One, the United States should appoint an ambassador as a Minsk Group co-chair. Andrew Schofer, who's wonderful and who was a colleague of mine in Vienna, has been doing that job for the last few years. But without the rank of ambassador, other countries often misinterpret that as somehow being a sign of lack of enthusiasm. And Andrew's a super capable diplomat, and that's not a comment at all about him. I have great admiration for him, but we should appoint an ambassador or make our person there an ambassador in order to signal our upping our engagement in the Minsk Group process, which is the OSCE's diplomatic process dealing with this conflict. We should also increase the number of people on the ground. There is a special representative of the chairperson in office on the ground, Ambassador Kasperchik, who has a small team, and that team I think is around 6 people. It needs to be much larger for the at least for the near term in terms of reporting and making sure that there's a lot of people moving around on the ground there. There's Azerbaijanis returning to newly recaptured territories. There are ethnic Armenians who are worried about sacred sites. We need more facts on coming from the ground in order to be able to address lingering political or ongoing political concerns before they generate new rounds of conflict. And then there's huge humanitarian needs, which the OSCE is not a humanitarian organization, but again, it can be a conduit, and it will need to partner with other organizations. And it can, by having an internationalized presence on the ground, it can be a credible conduit. And I think we have to remember that the two kind of proxy great powers in the region, Turkey and Russia, were both engaged in various ways, have both been engaged in this. Neither one of them has a great track record on being able to manage the humanitarian necessities after a conflict, which is not to discount what Turkey has done in terms of supporting refugees on its territory in recent years. But the post-conflict kind of humanitarian work is that, frankly, the United States is actually quite experienced at and quite good at. But it may not make sense for us to do that on a bilateral basis. It may make much more sense for us to support organizations like the OSCE in delivering that kind of humanitarian support on the ground. And so I think both at a political level and on a humanitarian on the ground level, there's a real opportunity for us to use the OSCE to try to move forward the peace process, because we shouldn't pretend like a new ceasefire is a substitute for peace.
Absolutely. And I did not mean to discount the OSCE role in the Minsk process over these many years. I just meant to say that in the latest conflict, they did not seem to be playing a very active role, at least as far as the media reporting went. I'm sure there was a lot going on behind the scenes. But I liked your comment about the OSCE potentially playing a role in humanitarian assistance and humanitarian cooperation as well, delivering assistance of that kind. I'm turning now, colleagues, to our list of questions. I have quite a few already, but if, again, just a reminder, if you'd like to post a question, please do so in the Q&A function or in the chat. Either way will work. But I have a question from Bogdan Oreshkovich asking, could the OSCE work together, perhaps with Russia, on COVID vaccination in the Ukraine region or in Europe? That's an interesting idea, but again, it would be in the delivery of humanitarian assistance, COVID response in general. And Bodan also asked, could OSCE provide services, protection, external connections for the Crimean Tatars? Those are two somewhat different questions, Dan, so I'll let you pick and choose a bit, but I think that general theme of how can the OSCE help in delivering humanitarian assistance is an important one, and I thank you, Bodan, for those questions. So back over to you, Dan.
Sure. I mean, I think there actually probably is a real opportunity, particularly in Donbass. And I guess folks may not be aware that there are Russian nationals serving in the OSCE observer mission. The OSCE observer mission, when I was last there, and I suppose it hasn't changed that much, but when I was last there, it was made up of nationals from over 30 countries, and I think that's one of the things that gives credibility on the ground to the OSCE observer mission, is that it's not one country or even 5 countries. It's not all NATO countries. It's not all non-NATO countries. It's a mix, and I think that gives it credibility. I should say, Rose, one thing about the Armenia-Azerbaijan question. I think going forward, if there's going to be peacekeepers on the ground, as you know, the November agreement that Putin brokered provided for Russian peacekeepers to be sent in, which reasonably gives people concern given the role that so-called Russian keepers have elsewhere in the region. I think one could imagine a situation where with engagement with Russia and with Russia's, it would take diplomacy, but one could imagine a situation where you would replace those with an OSCE, a multinational presence rather than a one country presence, and that could contribute to de-escalating and building confidence in the region. So anyway, going back to Ukraine, I think delivering the vaccine, the OSCE observers in Eastern Ukraine have played a role not only on reporting, but have often been a presence that has provided, for instance, when critical infrastructure needs to be repaired, the OSCE will be present so that the repairs can be made without either side on the conflict feeling like it is that humanitarian purpose is going to be used as a subterfuge for military advantage. And I think, in the same way, obviously the vaccination, there needs to be a vaccination drive around the line of contact. And it's entirely possible that the OSCE could play a role in, for instance, observing the distribution of vaccine. It probably isn't going to be actually putting shots in arms, but observing the distribution of vaccines to make sure that there is public confidence in, that they have been properly delivered and that they are being administered without handing off weapons or things like that, which would, there might otherwise be allegations or disinformation around it. So I think it could play a role there. I think it's less likely that it plays a role elsewhere in Europe, because I think elsewhere in Europe, national governments will largely play the leading role in figuring out the distribution plans. Although, perhaps in Transnistria there could be an effort, and in some of the Russian occupied territories in Georgia, there could be perhaps a coordination with the EU monitoring mission there. Maybe there's a role to play in ensuring that those folks get access to the vaccines, because obviously that is a public health issue that doesn't observe lines of contact or occupation or kinetic activity.
Yeah, those are some really interesting ideas. And indeed, in those areas that have been, well, a bit of no man's land in some ways for some aspects like delivery of medical services. And I'm very aware of the Georgian government's concerns, for example, with what's going on in South Ossetia and Abkhazia in terms of delivery of medical services to the population. That's a really interesting idea, to think that the EU mission there together with the OSCE might be able to play a helpful role. So worth thinking about further. Thank you for that. Well, here's a tough one from Irina Marchuk. She says, thanks for your thoughtful comments, insightful comments, Dan. And could you please comment on Putin's recent remarks that the West shouldn't be crossing any red lines in its interactions with Russia?
I'm going to come to that. I realized I didn't answer the question about Tatars. Just so you know, at least when I was at the OSCE, one of the things that we, the U.S. delegation, in partnership with a number of others, did was try to make sure that we were giving colleagues an opportunity to hear from Tatar leaders from Crimea, and indeed speaking in formal meetings, et cetera. There's, as you know, as you may know, the OSCE has a annual 2-week-long human rights conference held in Warsaw. There are always, in my experience, Tatar representatives there reporting on the situation on the ground. And I think it is important. That's just one example of the ways where across the OSCE space, including human and civil rights activists from the United States, the OSCE provides a platform for civil society to speak directly to governments and to speak about OSCE commitments that all governments have made with respect to human rights and fundamental freedoms. And so I think that is a crucial thing going forward, and really important in this day and age. I mean, going back to our first question, whether the OSCE is kind of out of date. I mean, if anything, the basic theory of the OSCE, the kind of political theory underlying it, that internal security, including human rights in a country, is directly connected to external security or international security, that has been proven by our experience in recent years. more repressive regimes are more likely to be a threat to their neighbors, which brings us to the question about Russia and Ukraine, and the question about Putin's so-called red lines. You know, I kind of I think we should take Putin, and obviously everything starts and ends there to a large extent, but take Putin very seriously when he's being serious, and at the same time also be pretty forceful in rejecting when he's not. You know, the things that Putin claims are Russian red lines are often nonsense, and we should say that's baloney. Get real. You're a grown-up president. You've been doing this for 2 decades now, despite protests and concerns from many of your populace. And like, you don't get to just throw out things as random red lines and demand that we kowtow to them. I mean, and you know, this is a line that Lavrov also likes to peddle, which is, you know, be super polite to Russia, otherwise we'll get mad. Well, you know, sometimes you don't deserve polite criticism because the things you're doing are really awful, and you don't get to dictate to us what the manner of engagement is. We will have a serious conversation with you when you are having a serious conversation, in order to attempt to resolve differences, certainly peacefully, and to try to find constructive ways forward. But part of that requires the Russians to act in good faith. And I guess what I'm saying is, I don't think that we, the US and our allies, do ourselves any favors by treating the Russians any differently than we would treat you know, each other if one of us said something that we thought was kind of nonsense. I mean, the respectful way to engage with them is to call out the BS when we think it's BS. That is respectful, because it means we're treating them as an equal, and that we expect them to behave like a grown-up country. And you know, so that recent statement, I kind of wished that instead of kind of everybody twittering about it, I wish we'd say like, okay, but you're making things up there, and that's not on. We'll have a serious conversation with you instead. And I think it's good for us to not kowtow. I think it's good for us to be honest and straightforward, and not incendiary or precipitous, but to when we think they're being ridiculous, to, you know, in as many words, to say so.
Yeah, I can't agree more, actually. And the whole, you know, red line remark was thrown out there without any clear indication of what the red lines are. So,
Yeah.
hello. Anyway,
Yeah, we're
I
going to
agree.
leave you to guess and make you
Right.
nervous. Like,
Exactly.
you know.
Ridiculous. Anyway, now Paul Meyer is bringing us around to the arms control agenda, which I wanted to talk about, and CSBM agenda. Paul asked, how has the Vienna document held up in recent years? And are there steps that could be made to enhance implementation of this particular set of confidence building measures? I also wanted to ask you, Dan, to comment, as you wished. The Open Skies Treaty is also in a very difficult situation at the moment. Russia having notified its withdrawal. The United States is considering its policy, with the Trump administration having notified withdrawal, but that still is a review ongoing in Washington, as I know. And furthermore, we've got the CFE treaty long in abeyance, with the Russians ceasing to implement it in 2007, 2008. But I'll just note that there are still notifications and information exchanges taking place in that setting, as well as from time to time some inspection activities. So what do you think? You know, is this whole panoply of conventional arms control treaties and agreements in Europe basically set to go up in smoke, or is there something we should be doing to refurbish them?
So I think I'm going to be surprising to people, perhaps, by saying that there may be a moment of optimism on this set of issues. As bad, we may have reached a point where, I mean, we may be at a point where it's gotten bad enough that it's either we're going to have to acknowledge that that chapter is closing and we need to move on to the next projects, or bad enough that there's actually an opportunity to collectively breathe new life into all of them, and perhaps all of them in conjunction with one another. Because, for instance, I think the Russians still care much more about the Open Skies Treaty, and have been more difficult on, say, Vienna document or CFE. Perhaps there is a broad conversation that can be had, and certainly it would be diplomatic malpractice for us to not try to have that conversation. We should not be desperate demandeurs, but we should also force the Russians to be the ones to say we're out. And I think, here, going back more broadly to your question about the Biden administration and the OSCE, and obviously the Forum for Security Cooperation is a companion organization, but on OST, or the Open Skies Treaty group signatories, on Open Skies, that's perhaps a great example of when you don't take a transactional approach. The whole theory behind having arms control treaties is that if you took if you asked somebody, every month, does this sound like a good idea to you? You expect that, like, sometimes it does and sometimes it doesn't, and sometimes the treaty is super convenient to you, and sometimes it's kind of a pain. Or that's the idea of having a treaty, is that you don't have it be a sequence of episodes of transactions. You have a broad framework that creates some stable expectations, and that at certain points it's going to be more cost than benefit to you as one participant, but that the overall project has value. And certainly, without it may be the case that certain people in the U.S. government feel like the Open Skies Treaty has more cost than benefit to us as a national government at this point. And yet, when when Russia invaded Ukraine, it was incredibly valuable to us to have extraordinary open skies flights, not because we needed it. We had other methods of getting intelligence, but we wanted many of our partners in Europe and the Ukrainians themselves to be able to see the situation on the ground. And so, it can be useful in ways that aren't directly, an important thing for your own kind of information gathering, but are actually part of building a relationship with partners and allies in order to generate the political will for constructive political solutions. And I think, it's more likely that the Biden administration will see value in those kinds of dividends that we can continue to harvest from conventional arms control than the Trump administration did. Now, the question about the Vienna document, yes, obviously we tried to use the Vienna document. We, the United States, tried to, and partners tried to use the Vienna document with the most recent buildup of Russian military forces in recent weeks, and the Russians did not behave or respond according to the expectations laid out in that document, which you could take as their demonstrating once again a kind of hostility towards it. There's no question that in order to be relevant in the coming decades, there needs to be a serious review and revision of the Vienna document to update it for current for new realities. And that's a case where, I think there should be a serious, quiet, not in front of cameras conversation with the Russians, because from my perspective, they should have as much interest in updating that document as any European partner should. One can imagine situations in which that would be incredibly useful for the Russians to have that set of expectations out. And so, I think we should sit down with them and have Open Skies, CFE, Vienna document, maybe some of the cyber conversations also on the agenda, and say, is there forward moving work to do together here? And if the answer is no, then it should be a Russian yet, not us walking away from the table, because I think in general there continues to be value in the United States and our partners leading on constructive, stable expectation setting, where instruments of potential destruction are involved. I think we have there's a peace dividend that remains to be won from these kinds of arrangements.
Thank you, Dan. And I do agree with you on the Open Skies Treaty that there's much more value in its predictability and confidence building nature. It's one of the few areas, frankly, where we have regular, still military to military interactions, because Russian, observers will be on any open skies flight over the Russian Federation territory. And if they call for open skies flights, then of course partners and the United States is observing those Russian flights. So it's a way, frankly, to bring military people together, military experts together to develop some mutual predictability. And I see that as the main value of the treaty these days, rather than its ability to take wet film pictures, which unfortunately is still what the US is limited to at the moment. But in any event, we're down to our last 9 minutes now, and I have a number of questions. I'm not going to get to all of them, colleagues, but I'd like to use your last kind of set of questions, Dan, to talk about the future of the OSCE. And Julek Ziamax says, thanks for a great webinar. And my questions are related to the future of the OSCE. Next year will be a Polish chairmanship for the OSCE. What would it be worthwhile for the Poles to put on the agenda for Ukraine and dialogue facilitation? And for example, should they look to perhaps expanding the special monitoring mission mandate? Or should they further develop that in some way? So whether you wish to pick up the exact question about what should the Poles put on the agenda, I'd be interested in how you see the future, the coming years for the OSCE. Why don't you talk about that a bit?
Sure. I think I would hope that there are consultations between the current Swedish chair, the Poles, the incoming Polish chair, as well as Berlin, London, Paris, and Washington about what the plans are for the next year. I think the SMMs, the chairmanship's push around the SMM should be done in tandem with a political diplomatic agenda that should be run alongside it, and that could be the Biden administration making a push with European partners to support a de-escalation and steps toward a political solution. It could be, a new kind of partnership with the UN. I'm not suggesting what the policy agenda should be, because I think I don't want to prejudice that. You could have a outside the box conversation, but the SMM should be seen as something that can support a broader political set of objectives. And so I hope the Polish chairmanship will make decisions about how it's going to lead and push for the development of the SMM in tandem with partners. I should say, one of the things that I think will be interesting for a Polish chairmanship is the backsliding on democracy and human rights in Poland. And I hope that it will be an opportunity for Polish organizations, as well as friends of Poland, and I count myself among them, to have honest conversations about our concerns about right-wing populism and damage to democratic institutions in Poland, because Poland has an enormously rich society and a really impressive track record in moving from communism to democracy in shorter amounts of time than many other places, and it would be a real shame to see that progress lost. So I'll stop there on the Polish chairmanship.
Thank you, Dan. Those are wise comments. I've just been asked, will there be a recording of this available? Yes, all of these webinars do go up on the CSAC website, so you will have the opportunity to review it again, or tell your friends about it if you'd like to spread the word. We'd be very, very grateful. Now, we just have a very few minutes left, and There's a mischievous question here from an anonymous attendee I'm going to lay on you, Dan, as the very last question. It has been said that the conflict in Ukraine helped the OSCE to survive. Do you agree?
Sorry, can you repeat it? My internet went out, perhaps saving me for a second. What was the beginning of the question?
It's a mischievous question a bit from an anonymous attendee. It has been said that the conflict in Ukraine helped the OSCE to survive. Do you agree?
I mean, survive maybe is overstating it, but to be candid, when I went out as ambassador, it was a quieter post, and I have deep sadness over what befell Ukraine in 2014, and I think it was in a world in which there are so many tragedies that are unavoidable. The chosen tragedies are especially sad. And to me, the conflict in Ukraine is a chosen tragedy, and the choice was made in Moscow, and that's particularly sad. But sure, I think the energetic engagement on the ground gave European capitals and Ottawa and Washington a new appreciation for the value of, this goes back to what I was saying about an insurance policy. If we didn't have the OSCE, we would have to recreate it. And for as long as we continue to have security challenges in the European space, which I don't think is ending anytime soon, I think we have to expect that we may not be able to predict when we need the OSCE in crisis situations, but we can predict that we will need it in crisis situations. And I guess the only other thing I would say is, the reason I said survive is an overstatement. The OSCE does a lot of quiet work on the ground in 16 field missions around the OSCE area all the time that doesn't make the front pages of newspapers, but that is essential to the long-term building up of democratic societies. And so, that work was ongoing, but I think the kind of high politics, high diplomacy value of OSCE was underscored by the invasion of Ukraine and the response to it. And I certainly recognized, all of a sudden I was in nightly conversations with the White House on secure video conferences about what was going on in Ukraine. And it wasn't normal for the ambassador of the OSCE to have a nightly meeting with the Deputy National Security Advisor before that. And obviously that elevates US attention on an organization, elevates the importance of the organization more broadly. And, I expect we will see that sustained in the Biden administration as well, because I think there is an enduring appreciation. Toria Nuland was the Assistant Secretary for Europe at the time, and now is going to be the Undersecretary of State. She knows what we did there at that time. And so, I think rather than saying it helped it to survive, do I think it breathed new life? Certainly it did. And that is a silver lining in what I think is overall a tragedy.
Thank you, Dan. Very well said indeed. And thank you for such a good presentation today. It's been a real pleasure chatting with you about the OSCE. I agree with you that it doesn't always get the attention it deserves, but I thank you for everything you've done to lay out the current agenda and what we should and perhaps should push to bring about in future for the organization. But I especially want to thank you in this last intervention for talking about the quiet role that the OSCE plays in so many places around Europe. So thank you all very much for participating again. I'm sorry we can't give you a big hand in person, Dan, but I know everybody's giving you a big hand in the virtual space. So thank you again for being with us, and let's stay in touch.
Thank you so much for having me. Such a pleasure.